Things were looking up for Albert Ostman in the summer of 1924. Rumors of gold coming out of Toba Inlet in British Columbia had made up his mind that it was time for a vacation. He was a young man, only 31 at the time, and the days spent in the woods cutting lumber for a living were getting old. Gold and the promise of a better life was calling to him, as it did to many people at the time. Stories of riches made during the California gold rush still fueled many dreams, Albert's included. And it was there, in British Columbia, that Albert Ostman had a very strange encounter with Bigfoot. Toba Inlet is one of the many inlets along the coast of British Columbia, and as an inlet, it's one of the smaller ones. It stretches 21.5 miles inland to the Toba River and is 1.5 miles at its widest. Near the mouth of the inlet, Albert had been told there had once been a gold mine. Its location was no longer common knowledge. In fact, nobody knew where it was, so it could technically be called a lost gold mine. That is, of course, if there ever had been one there at all, in which case it wasn't only lost, but it was a tall tale. Gold mine or not, he picked up his things, grabbed his Winchester rifle, and boarded a steamship. And then began the long trek into the British Columbia woods. Albert had heard stories about wood giants from an old Indian guide he'd hired to take him to the inlet. Tales of large, hairy men who roamed the woods. One of the stories involved another prospector who had disappeared one day. And according to the Indian, the wood giant, whom he called Sasquatch, was responsible. If any of this made Albert nervous, he didn't show it. The woods were in his blood. Plus, he had his rifle. There were real predators in the forest to worry about, like grizzly bears and wolves. And old folk tales of wood giants were nothing more than entertaining stories to be told around a fire. The weather in the mountains were good to Albert. He hiked during the day and camped at night, and it was quiet and uneventful, and on a clear day he could pass the time watching the boats in the inlet far below. But not too much time. There was the prospect of gold in those hills. 25 miles and days later, he set up camp beside a rock wall. Not too far from the site there was a spring as well. He couldn't have asked for a better spot to rest or to set up a base camp. So Albert settled in for what promised to be a good night's sleep. The next morning, he was certain that something had entered his camp during the night. Nothing had been taken, but he knew things had been disturbed, if only slightly. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, some of his supplies actually were missing. His knapsack had been dumped out, and his pancake flour was gone among some other small items. That meant no breakfast, at least when it came to pancakes. He first suspected porcupines. It couldn't have been a bear. Albert was a heavy sleeper, but even a bear would have woken him up. The next night, Albert hugged his rifle a little closer. Things were about to get a bit more interesting as well. Thoughts of the old Indian tales and stories of strange forest men covered in hair accompanied him to sleep. And when Albert woke up in the middle of the night, it was not because he'd heard a sound. He'd been picked up, sleeping bag and all. In the first few moments of consciousness, he thought that perhaps he had started to slide down the hill. Then he realized he was being carried. His bag had been slung over the shoulder of, well, something. He could hear it wheezing as it walked. Albert remained silent out of fear. Luckily, he still had his rifle with him. Whether or not he would have a chance to use it remained to be seen. Hours later, he was dropped onto the forest floor. Suffering muscle cramps from his journey and, more than a little scared, Albert scrambled out of his sleeping bag and stepped into a nightmare. There were 4 of them from what he could see. 4 hairy bipedal creatures covered in hair. 2 adults and 2 what he assumed to be teenagers. A male and a female. A family. They didn't speak, but they made sounds. Chattering sounds. Albert tried to ask what they wanted with him. He didn't try to shoot them, though. He was afraid his little Winchester might not be powerful enough to stop the biggest one. What he assumed to be the father must have been close to 8 feet tall and easily over 600 pounds. A quick look also told him that he was trapped. He had been carried into a small valley, and the only way out appeared to be an opening near the far end. To get there, he would have to get past the large male of the group. At least he was alive, and the creatures, well, they appeared to be just as curious about him as he was of them. Curious isn't the right word to describe Albert's state of mind. He was terrified. He took stock of what little supplies he had left. The creature who'd carried him in had also carried in his backpack. There was some food left, but his box of rifle shells had fallen out along the way. So, Albert did the only thing he could do. He settled in and waited. The very next morning, Albert made a move to leave, but he was stopped by the large male. The teenagers, both of them, looked on, but kept their distance. The girl, Albert could tell, was the shyest one of the group. She spent most of the time watching everything that was going on from behind a tree. His mind racing, Albert needed a plan. Earlier, he'd spotted the teenagers playing with an empty can of snuff. So, Albert put on a show. He made some coffee and acted like snuff was the best thing in the world, smacking his lips for effect. The old man, that's what Albert came to refer to him as, saw this and moved a little closer. Albert's plan was simple. If he could get the old man to eat a full can of snuff, he would be able to make his move. If the full can didn't kill him, it might make the old man sick enough for Albert to escape. The teenagers were timid and the old lady was slow. There was a chance he could make it. Albert's acting with the can of snuff paid off. As soon as he was close enough, the old man grabbed the snuff and finished it off in one large gulp. Albert held his breath and waited. It didn't take long. After a few minutes, the old man began to moan. He was soon rolling on the ground in pain. And this was it. Albert grabbed his sleeping bag and knapsack and stuffed it with as many supplies as he could. If he got out of this, he still had a long, terrifying trek back. His only hope, beside escape, was that he could even find his way back. In the confusion that followed, Albert only fired one shot from his rifle, and this was to scare the old lady away. He then faced the long way back to civilization. Albert made it out. He eventually emerged from the wilderness, stumbled upon some loggers, and found his way to Seashell Inlet, where he caught a boat back home. Now, what did the loggers think of his story? They didn't. Nobody did. Not for another 33 years. In 1957, upon hearing about other people telling similar stories, Albert decided to come forth and tell his story to the local paper. He continued to tell his story in his own laid-back way, without embellishments or changes, until his death in 1975. But we will never really know what Albert experienced in 1924. We have only his word to go by. Perhaps a long trek from the Toba Inlet into the woods of British Columbia might reveal something. Maybe a few stray cans of decades-old food, an old snuff can at the base of a cliff, or the glint of a spent Winchester shell in a bed of pine needles. Or maybe you might find something else. There were 4 of them in 1924, according to Albert Ostman: a mother, a father, and 2 children. The parents are most certainly no longer with us, if they were ever with us at all. And the children? Well, unlikely. But if there were more, well, lost gold mine aside, it might not be a bad idea to bring a friend. Or, better yet, stay out of the woods. Thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and leave a review. It really does help others to find the show. And if you know someone who might enjoy the show, please tell them about it. You can find more information and references that went into this episode by going to strangeencounters.org. I would really like to hear your suggestions for future episodes as well. And if you've had a strange encounter with something unusual or paranormal, I would love to hear it. Visit the contact page for more information on submitting your story. And until next time, please take care of yourself. It's a strange world out there.
I'm